Okay, I hope you had a chance to do some yoga, take a stress, contemplate the nature of reality, realize that thou art, you are that, after all. I'm going to talk kind of briefly at this point about Patanjali, and then we'll close up for the day. So Patanjali, and White talks about Patanjali pretty well in the book, so I'm kind of reviewing sort of his arguments here. So who's Patanjali? But Patanjali is the guy who wrote the Yoga Sutras. Now, we have the Yoga Sutras, and we have the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, which is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras with Vyasa's commentary on it. And together that's called the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, the speaking on the Yoga Sutras. And even scholars who study it these days just call it the Bhashya. So Patanjali was the guy that set out those terse verses that we read in Stoller Miller and Bryant. Excuse me. And Patanjali is supposedly this author. So we don't know who Patanjali is. We got nothing. He doesn't tell us who he is. You have these things called colophons in Sanskrit texts, and a colophon is at the end of every chapter and at the end of every text. It says, I, so-and-so, Swami Upendra, not Bodhiji, wrote this text in this place under the patronage of King Bodhajnana in the year of X and Y. If you're lucky, it'll have that in the Sanskrit text. We don't have that. We don't know when Patanjali lived. We don't know anything about him from these sources. Just like we don't know anything about that Vyasa guy who wrote the first commentary that creates the Yoga Sutra Bhashya. So again, we don't know who that guy is. So some people say that the Vyasa is one of these other Vyasas. We're going to see there are a couple other Patanjalis too. So let's get back to our PowerPoint. And who is Patanjali? Well, there's three dudes called Patanjali in Indian literature. There's actually probably more. You have the author of the Yoga Sutra, who I was talking about before. So this guy is, 4th century, and maybe it's commentary, also in the 4th century. Now, in the 12th century, there's a text called the Mahabhashya. Bhashya again. So that means great speech. Now, the Mahabhashya is 12th century, and it is a text of grammar. So in Sanskrit, you have a type of genre called Vyakarana, which means grammar. It helps you understand how to connect words, how to separate words, how to interpret words, how to write, and how to interpret Sanskrit. You also have, and this is much earlier, the Charakasamhita. Well, that's a text that arguably could be 2nd century BCE, and he's also named Patanjali. So we know a little bit about this 12th century guy that wrote the Mahabhashya, and we know very little about the guy that wrote the Charakasamhita, but we have Patanjali from the Yoga Sutras, 4th century. We have a 12th century text on grammar. We have another text called, medical text called the Charakasamhita that was written 2nd century BCE. So are these all the same guy? I would argue likely not, unless you have an ever-living guy who knows a whole bunch of different types of topics. I mean, these are pretty vastly different topics. So just positing that they're the same author is kind of ridiculous. And also the style of writing is completely different in all three of them. Also, he would have to be 1,400 years old in order to have written all three texts. And the Charakasamhita would have been his first one. We have characters in Buddhism like Nagarjuna, who was, Nagarjuna was a Buddhist logician. He is also an alchemist. This would be one in the 4th century, one in the 6th century. There's also characters named Nagarjuna in lots of different literary texts. In fact, if you start looking at Sanskrit texts authored by Nagarjuna, they're all really different. But it's basically like saying this guy's name's Dr. Smith, and he wrote this book in the 1800s and the 1300s and in 300 BCE. And what's the usual assumption that one would make? Oh, there's 3 different dudes named Dr. Smith. Well, I would argue there's 3 different Patanjalis. However, some people argue he's the same guy. So they would say that this one guy wrote these 3 texts. As for the Yoga Sutra author, as I said, we have no clue from the Yoga Sutra or the related texts who he is. So you can make it on a claim of faith that he was a 1,400-year-old Siddha, or long-living immortal being, but I'm not willing to take that. We do have a story that starts in the 12th century at the earliest that breaks up his name. Pata means fallen, and Anjali means sort of like Anjali, Anguli. Anjali means like joined hands. So fallen, it means fallen from the hand, or from the hand he has fallen. So there's a story from South India in the 12th century that says there's a woman who was performing her daily worship rituals, and she was holding her hands up like this, as you do when offering water. This is even called the Anjali move. And a snake-like creature manifested just in space through the grace of God, evidently, and fell into her hands. She was surprised and she dropped it. And this became her son, Patanjali. So look at this picture here. This is supposed to be Patanjali, one of the many Patanjalis. Notice he's half snake. So there is this interesting connection of Patanjali and serpents and snakes. So a snake in India is called a naga. Nagas are thought to live under the earth, and they are supposed to reveal great wisdom. So under the earth is where you find jewels and precious metals, but it's also where you find precious wisdom. So much later, people start to say that this Patanjali, the guy who the half serpent creature that fell from the woman's hand, is the same Patanjali who wrote the Yoga Sutras. Of course, the story about the snake falling from the hand was in the 12th century, but in reality, there's been no temple to anyone worshiping Patanjali until 2004, when a very specific yoga guru, BKS Iyengar, he actually who based a lot of his ideas on the Yoga Sutras. Well, on about 8 verses out of the Yoga Sutras. But anyway, BKS Iyengar, this contemporary yoga guru, built a temple to Patanjali in 2004. But there was none of this before. Now, in Iyengar's class, he has students chant a praise to Patanjali, in which Patanjali, and it's in Sanskrit, and it says, "Oh, Patanjali, you great," like it says, like, "Oh, you great doctor, you wrote the Charaka Samhita. Oh, you great grammaticist, and your Vyakarna. Oh, you Yoga Sutras guy." So in this chant that all these students say before each class, they praise Patanjali in that way. Now, on page 39 in White's book here, you'll see without the, that's me, so it's written all through it. So Patanjali, in this one phrase, you find, the 12th century phrase, actually you find this on page 38. I didn't even know it. So in the 18th century, a Shaiva master from South Indian state of Karnataka said, "Out of the grace of the world and by the will and by way of introducing the sciences of yoga and so forth, the primal serpent Shesha took the form of the 7-year-old son of a Brahmin woman named Gonika. By virtue of falling into her hand, he was named Patanjali." Okay, so that's 18th century. Now, in the 20th century, we get this story that pulls together everything from his part snakiness to his grammar to everything. And we learn about his mother's name is Gonika. So here I'm reading on page 39 and just 39, Adi Shesha. Now, Adi Shesha means the primordial serpent, who's also known as Ananta. Adi Shesha, remember, serpent, wisdom, intelligence. Adi Shesha then began to meditate to ascertain who would be his mother on earth. In meditation, he had the vision of a yogini. Notice we have the word yogini here. I've talked about that before. It usually means a witch, but here it's referring to a woman who does yoga. He had a vision of a yogini by the name of Gonika, who was praying for a worthy son to whom she could impart her knowledge and wisdom. Oh yeah, her name is Gonika. That's she who has a lot of gunas. Gonika, a lot of gunas. Guna can also mean great qualities. All right. He at once realized that she would be a worthy mother for him and awaited an auspicious moment to become her son. Gonika, thinking that her earthly life was approaching its end and that her desire of finding a worthy son would remain unfulfilled. Now, as a last resort, she looked to the sun god, aka Surya, the sun god, the living witness of God on earth, and prayed to him to fulfill her desire. She took a handful of water as a final oblation to the sun, closed her eyes, and meditated on the sun. As she was about to offer the water, she opened her eyes and looked at her palms. To her surprise, she saw a tiny snake moving in her palms, who soon took on a human form. This tiny male human prostrated to Gonika and asked her to accept him as her son. This she did and named him Patanjali. Pata means falling or fallen, and Anjali means hands folded in prayer. Gonika's prayer with folded hands thus bears the name Patanjali. Slow down a minute here, BKS Iyengar. So you're saying that the sun god granted the primordial serpent, which holds all wisdom, granted him a human form as a snake-like thing, and put him in this one lady's hand, and this is the guy that wrote the Yoga Sutras. So if you read the Yoga Sutras, there's no discussion of him being the primordial serpent. There's no discussion of the sun god. There's only one discussion to Yogeshwar. There's no discussion of him being an incarnation of the primordial serpent Shesha or Adi Shesha. There's none of that. That's all put together later. So who is Patanjali? Patanjali, we got some vague figure that's an incarnation of a primordial serpent. We got these three authors, and later, really, in the 20th century, you have him being described as being all these three and being an incarnation of a primordial serpent. And in 2004, BKS Iyengar built a temple to him. Been a temple anywhere in Patanjali before, or anywhere to Patanjali before. So when people talk about the Yoga Sutras as being revealed by this incarnation of this great serpent, all of that mythology is relatively recent. So this is how it goes in India often. You get a lot of stories with some resonances, you put them together, and if you can tell it in a good and innovative way, well, then you got a story that you can do stuff with. All right, so my closing point is, on all of this, magic powers. Yoga Sutras 316 to 4.3. It's a fair amount of verses. It's completely about yoga powers. So what are yoga powers? What do magic powers have to do with all this like liberation business that I've been talking about? Well, the one who is liberated through Sankhya, or maybe even Advaita Vedanta, definitely through Tantra or Bhakti, can do miracles. Specifically, they can have yoga powers. When Sankhya is resolved, when the mind stuff is free, when you can manipulate Prakriti any darn way you want because you're just Purusha and you can manipulate Prakriti from then on, you'll get powers. You can go into other people's bodies. You can fly. You can be invisible. You can read minds. You can know past and future of lives. So look at that Yoga Sutras 3.16 all the way through 4.3 one more time and think about yoga powers. So go forth, find truth. You've had innumerable rebirths up to this point, stretching an infinite time in the past, and likely you will have infinite in the future. You're bound to hear all this stories of liberation and ways to liberation at some point in one of these many lives. Well, you've heard it in this one. So go for it. Find the truth. Or don't. Sometimes it's just nice to crack a beer and chat about the nature of the world. And sure, that's passing, according to Buddhism and all. But I like the pleasant things in life. And if there are innumerable lives in my past, there's probably innumerable lives in my future. This is probably as good as it's going to get. And I'm all right with that. But that's me. So I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now. Cheers.